All right, today we're looking at this fun little grinder, the Femobook A68. And despite this grinder's, compact size, in here is hiding a really quite large 68 millimeter conical burr. This one was sent to me by Femobook via the team at Rogue Wave Coffee here in Canada. Now, I didn't totally know what to expect. I had seen just kind of in passing this grinder at the SCA Expo earlier this year. It definitely had some surprises in store for me. Now, Femobook is based in Taiwan, home to another grinder manufacturer that I have actually covered a lot on this channel, Espresso. And something I heard that caught my ear pretty much immediately was that some of the talent who has been developing these grinders were originally involved with the team at Espresso. Now, I love Espresso grinders, so that kind of got my attention right away. The A68 comes in champagne gold, which is this color right here, as well as black, and then a couple different combinations. You have champagne gold and red, you have black and red, and you have black and champagne gold. Using the grinder is very simple. You have this power switch over here. You just give that a little press, and then you dump your beans in. There we go. And in short order, you have your coffee grounds right here. Once it's done grinding, the grounds are all in this little magnetic dosing cup down here. And if I were to pull this out right now and measure the output, it would actually be pretty light compared to what I actually put in. And that's because there is some static and retention that can kind of happen in this chute right here. And the way to get around that is to just kind of pop the chute off and tap it down into the dosing cup, and then I'm basically gonna have zero retention. Not a lot of static inside the dosing cup itself, which is good. Now, even though that basically kills any retention with this grinder, I did find that kind of no matter what I did, there was a little bit of mess that would take place, and you can get rid of that just by blowing it away. But that definitely is something that you do need to manage a little bit. All right, so let's make a coffee here. This is a coffee roasted by Rogue Wave and grown by Wilton Benitez. It's a variety called Sudan Rumé, and it's an anaerobic washed coffee. I got this coffee from Rogue Wave earlier this year, and I enjoyed it so much I actually froze a little bit of it. Now, when it comes to filter coffee, normally I'm not totally in love with larger electric conicals, and in that regard I was actually pleasantly surprised by this grinder. We will get into some direct comparisons in a bit here, but first let's just see how we're doing on this cup. I'm brewing today on the UFO dripper. That's a joint effort by a fellow named Kenzie and Jay, based out of the US and Korea respectively. And with a little bit of movie magic, we'll finish up this brew and we'll see how this tastes. Okay, that is a really nice coffee, great balance. Lots of fruit coming out. I'm getting like mango and pineapple. Some nice herbal elements coming through here that I didn't have previously. Delicious coffee. Now, before we go too much further and really start deep diving on some of this stuff, I want to show you something that is really cool about this grinder. At first, this almost even freaked me out a little bit how easy this was, but everything on here is magnetic. This bean chute up here, this little section right here slides right out. This is the slide where the beans will kind of slide their way down to the burrs. The dosing cup is magnetic, as well as this chute here. There's little brushes in here that will kind of clean that burr off as it's spinning around to try and get some of that static off of that burr. And then this is really neat. To get the burr out, we'll just take this guard off here, also magnetic, and lift this sleeve up right here. And then this whole assembly just comes right out. And at this point, the grinder is almost fully disassembled. You have the motor at the back here, and you have those giant burrs right here. And you don't have to stop there. You can actually go further still. You can pop this grind adjustment ring off, and then you can really get a close look in here on this burr assembly. And when you look closely, you can see these little black metal parts in here. And on this inner ring is this little dot. And if you want to remove the burr, all you need to do is actually give a little bit of pressure and then turn it so that the dot is on a flat rather than a corner. And then the whole lower burr will just slide right out. Now the outer burr here measures 68 millimeters. This is about 50 millimeters across. And you can see it's an 8-pointed burr. And as far as geometry goes, you know, it looks kind of similar to some Espresso burrs with these teeth kind of extending all the way up the pre-breaker. And when you look in the housing for the outer burr, you'll see the lower bearing there, and there is a second bearing up here with a solid metal housing for the axle. And that is going to hold the lower burr and axle in a very fine tolerance for alignment, which is a really good thing, especially when it comes to conical grinders, where if they get out of alignment, things can get kind of gnarly. And because all of that is kind of self-contained within this assembly, anything going on up here with the sleeve or up here with the gears and the drivetrain is not going to have any impact on alignment whatsoever. This grinder, when I got it, it was excellently aligned. You know, I can be a real stickler for this kind of thing. I really check to try and see how well aligned is this grinder, and I was very impressed with how well this grinder was aligned out of the box. Now, when you're ready to kind of put things back, things are pretty nearly just as quick. Make sure your spring and your washer are on. If you're in doubt, make sure the little rim on the washer is pointing upward. Then you slide your burr back in. Again, give it some upward pressure until it slides up above that sleeve, and then just rotate that sleeve so that the dot is on a point on that little axle. Once the burr is on, you can put the adjustment ring back on, slide the whole assembly into the grinder body. Now, because the tolerances are so tight, that can be a little tricky getting that in there. Put this little grounds funnel here under the burr, the dosing cup under there. Then we're gonna put this guard back up on the front and then slide that chute on there. And last but not least, we'll put the bean funnel on the top, and we're totally reassembled. Now, that is just kind of fun. And when I first got this grinder, I just did that over and over again, kind of like a little fidget toy. All those tolerances are tight, but not generally so tight that it's actually difficult to do. It's very kind of satisfying to snap back together. Now, before we get into cons, considerations, and technical performance with this grinder, let's talk about how it compares to some of the other big conical grinders on the market. When this appeared on my bar, one of the things that I got asked the most often was, how does it compare against the Weber Key? It's actually a lot closer in price to the Niche Zero, offers a larger burr than the Niche Zero, and depending on what you're looking for in your cup, it really does offer great value as an all-around grinder. Let's talk about filter coffee first. Now, the Weber Key probably is my favorite conical grinder when it comes to espresso. When it comes to filter, however, usually I go in another direction. It can do it, but I find that there are other grinders that will do a little bit better of a job on filter for less money. The Niche Zero I find very similar. I love that grinder on espresso. It's really hard to beat for traditional espresso, and the workflow is absolutely tops. On filter, I find the Niche Zero lacks a little bit. Compared to both of those grinders, I much preferred the A68 when it came to filter coffee. Now, a little bit of a secret about me. When it comes to pour overs, I basically exclusively hand grind my coffee. I don't know what it is. I just find that I get better results when I am grinding by hand. I think a big part of that is the slow RPM of hand grinders. This grinder comes in at about 60 RPM, so very comparable to what you would be doing with a hand grinder. So I pulled out the Espresso K-Ultra as well as the Comandante C40, and I did some heads to heads when it came to pour over with the A68. Both of those are grinders that get a very high recommendation from me depending on what you're looking for. I have reviews of both of them on my channel, and when I tested the A68 against them, especially because there's a little bit of overlap with some expertise from the Espresso team, I was really expecting it to kind of be pretty similar to the K-Ultra, and it was a little less similar than I expected. I actually found it leaning a little bit more to the zone of the C40. I found the K-Ultra to be a little bit more acidity forward than this grinder. This was, you know, a little bit more blended, well-rounded of a flavor profile. I did find that there was just a little bit of edge coming in from what I would probably expect to be fines created by this burr set that would just kind of creep in along the edges of the flavor profile. But still, compared to other electric conical grinders, I was really happy with the performance on filter. I did find that depending on the type of coffee I was drinking, that it would become a little bit more muted as it cooled compared to some of the other grinders that I tested against. Still, fantastic cups overall though. As far as espresso goes, this grinder had good performance as well. When compared to the Weber Key, which is again like 3 times the price, personally I found that for how I like to run the Key, I did prefer that on espresso, but this was also giving me really good cups. I found it to give me a little bit more body. Like, I would describe the profile that I like to get out of the Key as being satiny, and I would say that the body on this was more like a velvet. A little bit less than the Niche Zero, which again, depending on what you're looking for, could be a good or a bad thing. I also found that the taste profile on this was a little more acidity forward than the evenness of the Key. And I did find that it gave a little bit more flavor separation than I was getting out of the Niche Zero. So I think the fact that it can even kind of stand next to those two grinders and do some things better and some things kind of differently, I would say is definitely a mark in its favor. So let's talk about performance tests. Volume wise, this is not the quietest grinder. It's about 70 dB on idle, and while grinding it kind of comes up closer to 80 dB, and that's more on the louder side for a conical grinder. As far as grind speed, I was finding an 18-gram shot of espresso would take me about 30 seconds, and grinding a 16-gram filter dose, that's what I normally do, came in at just under 15 seconds or so. It is a stepped grinder, meaning that each setting you kind of click into and you can't go between the two of them. You have 3 revolutions of range, which is quite a bit of range. For espresso, I was finding myself usually in between settings 7 and 8, which is 70 to 80 steps. And on filter, I was tending to be another full revolution beyond that. Each step on this grinder is about 8 microns. And what you want to be concerned about more than what that number is what that actually translates into as far as fidelity goes when dialing in espresso. And what I mean by that is how much difference in shot time are you going to see between each setting? And I was finding, depending on the coffee and how close I was to the sweet spot, somewhere between 2 and 5 seconds difference in shot time between each step. So definitely enough room there to dial in a good shot of espresso. Going back and forth between filter and espresso was not a huge deal. I wasn't finding the grinder would kind of bind up with grounds that were left over in there at all when I was going finer. Retention, as I said, basically 0, as long as I did that shoot tappy thing where I brought that ground chute down into the grind cup to knock out anything that was hanging out in there. If I didn't do that, I could get up to 2.5 or so grams of retention, all of which would be hiding out in here. So that's something that you will need to work into your workflow for sure. I didn't find I would get any kind of meaningful retention anywhere else in the grinder. And if you're worried about that, you can use this blower to kind of purge any grounds through the system. Now, seasoning grinders is something I'll often do. I ran about 3 kilos of coffee through this grinder just to see if the burrs would change at all as they aged. Some grinders that makes a big difference. I didn't really find much meaningful difference when it came to this grinder. I was getting good shots out of the gate with it, and after seasoning, I wasn't seeing any huge differences. So that's a positive. So we have a grinder that stands against some pretty big names in the conical space and comes out as a very capable all-rounder. And at that point, you have to ask, what are the negatives that are coming along for the ride when it comes to this grinder? There are some things that you're going to want to be aware of if this is a grinder that you're thinking about. A big one that I haven't actually touched on at all is the power brick. Now, these are not things that I am a huge fan of on a good day, but this one is particularly large. If you have a counter setup or a coffee bar setup where you can hide this, that might be all well and good. There's even little ears on here where you can screw it to the underside of a counter or the back of a piece of furniture. If this grinder is going to go somewhere where you might not be able to hide something this big, don't expect to be able to easily hide it and all the cable that comes along with it behind the grinder itself. There are reasons why manufacturers use these things, but I just find in a practical sense, they're kind of a pain. The mess is actually a bit of a con for me, you know? Both the Niche and the Weber Key, they're very clean grinders as far as workflow goes. And just the fact that, you know, I'm gonna have some coffee grounds fall out of here most of the time to some degree or another on this nice clean plate down here. You know, you do get used to cleaning that area, but it is a bit of an extra thing to have to think about. The sound, I think, is gonna be a negative for some people, you know, not just the volume, but the quality. It's not the nicest sound to listen to, so weigh that out depending on how important that is to you. The color choice is also an interesting one. You know, this champagne gold color, it's kind of a distinctive color, you know. If you have a lot of stainless steel or brushed metal, it's not necessarily gonna blend in the best way. And if you're not totally into the other color options, that's kind of all that you got. And as far as aesthetics overall go, not all the choices are totally my thing. The logo's a little bit bigger than maybe I would like. People really seem to gravitate to the aesthetic overall, or they tend to not really care for it very much. I would love to hear your thoughts on that one, actually. On the plus side, besides the static, you know, little grinds accumulating down here, the workflow of this grinder is very nice. It's very satisfying to use, small footprint besides the power brick, easy to use, easy to clean, lots of plus sides. So who should be considering this grinder? It's not way up there in terms of price point, but it's up there enough where you're probably going to want to be pretty careful with your purchase decision. If you're really chasing high-end clarity and flavor separation for your brews, I might push you to a flat burr grinder. If you're just looking for traditional style espresso shots, I know there are so many grinders out there, it still is so hard to beat the Niche Zero for traditional espresso. It just really hits a sweet spot, both in terms of what you're gonna get on the cup, as well as the workflow, which still is pretty hard to beat. If you are looking for some good body and blend in your espresso, but you also want a grinder that can perform on filter and not really feel like you're leaving a lot on the table, all in kind of one grinder, and this is in your price range, this is definitely worth looking at. I think that zone is where the A68 is carving out a nice little space for itself. It does espresso well, but it's also doing filter better than a lot of the conical grinders that are really excelling in the espresso space. If this video helped you out at all, something that you can do to help me out is subscribe to my channel. That's the best way to support me making more of these reviews. And I'd love to hear what you think about the A68. Is this grinder sitting at like a perfect little intersection of several worlds, or are you looking for something a little bit different? If you own one of these things, I would love to hear from you, and that's something that's actually really helpful for other people who may be watching this video too. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.